Some people enter Harvard through the front gate, armed with perfect grades and letters of recommendation from prominent figures. Others get in through connections, scholarships, or simply by privilege. And then there are people like her, Amira Thompson, the one who silently pushes a cleaning cart through the service hallways each night, carrying a mop, an old, worn-out ID badge, and a dream that has been carefully tucked away in silence, to the point where she's no longer sure if it's still alive or if it died the day she was 17. But that night, as she stopped in front of an unerased chalkboard in room 3.24 and saw the unfinished formulas, she knew that dream was still there and it was waiting for her to come back. Expanded version of Part 1. Shadows, Mops, and a Forgotten Dream. More than 1,000 words. The cold wind seeped through the cracks in the windows of Jefferson Hall, the towering science building standing proudly in the heart of Harvard's campus. It was 1:42 a.m. All the rooms were dark, save for the faint glow from the hallway lights reflecting off the cold marble floors. In that silence, Amira Thompson's footsteps echoed softly, rhythmic, like a habit ingrained deep within her. She wore a faded gray uniform jacket, shoes worn down at the heels, and was pushing a cart full of cleaning supplies. Her other hand clutched the mop like an old friend, one that had been with her through countless quiet nights. The ID badge pinned to her chest had no department name, no academic title, just a simple label: Staff, Janitorial Services. Amira, 26, black, orphaned, had dropped out of a high school in the 12th grade. No one in these ivory towers knew her name. To the students here, she was just an anonymous figure who appeared when they were fast asleep or buried in their laptops at the library. No one asked her name. No one knew that the lines on the chalkboard that they erased without a second thought to start a new day were once something she had longed to write herself. Every night Amira began her shift at midnight, when the world outside was still and Harvard was cloaked in silence. But for her, it wasn't just a job. It was a form of survival in silence, a nameless series of repeating days, endless hallways, desks covered in chalk dust, and blackboards filled with dense equations that she silently memorized with her eyes. No one knew that before becoming the night janitor, she was the top student in the math department at her public high school in New Jersey. She had been nominated by teachers for Olympic math competitions and spent hours in the public library watching MIT OpenCourseware math lectures on an old computer. But then, her mother fell ill. Stage 4 breast cancer, no insurance, no one to take care of her. Amira put everything on hold, her dreams, her future, her youth. She turned down a scholarship to step into the world with a mop in her hand, with the promise that it would only be temporary. But once life swept her along, those temporary things often turned into forever. Tonight was no different. She finished cleaning the first floor, now heading up to the second. The graduate classrooms. The hallway here stretched endlessly, like a maze of knowledge. She had once dreamed of stepping into these classrooms as a student, not as someone cleaning them, but that dream had been buried under hospital bills and late-night shifts that stretched into the early hours of the morning. As she approached room 3.24, Amira stopped. A faint yellow light leaked from under the door, an anomaly for a classroom that should have had the lights off since midnight. She pushed the door open gently. No one was inside. But what made her freeze was the chalkboard at the front of the room. Unlike usual, where the board was either erased or hastily scribbled on, today, the entire surface was covered in dense, white chalk equations. Familiar symbols seemed to call out to her. Derivatives, matrix transformations, non-linear optimization, but not in the hurried, sloppy writing of a student. No, this was a well-structured system, rhythmic and beautiful. Amira wasn't sure how long she stood there, but she could feel her heart beating faster than normal. Something within her stirred. Her hunger for knowledge, her addiction to logic, and the old pain that still hadn't healed. Without thinking, she walked over to the board, gently placed the mop down, and nervously picked up a fresh piece of chalk. She didn't erase anything. Instead, she silently added to the work, continuing it like picking up the notes of a symphony left unfinished. Each symbol she wrote down felt like a note ringing in her heart, one after another, like a breath. In that moment, she was no longer Amira, the janitor. She was the student she used to be. She was the girl who had once asked why the world was so unfair. She was the one who had dreamed of going to MIT. She was the daughter who had held her mother's hand as she took her last breath, promising, "I'll go back to school someday." In the hallway, the clock struck 2:06 a.m. Not far away, a man had entered the building unnoticed, Professor Elijah Wren, who had just realized he'd forgotten his seminar materials. He was walking toward room 3.24, and no one knew what happened in the next 10 minutes would forever change the fate of Amira Thompson. This is a detailed translation and expansion of the provided story into English, maintaining the emotional depth and atmosphere while providing the context of Amira's silent journey and the pivotal moment ahead. The light from the lecture table cast faint reflections, making the white chalk marks on the blackboard appear like distant nebulae in the silent universe. The soft whistling of the wind outside the window and the light filtering through the crack in the door were the only things breaking the sacred silence of room 3.24. But for Amira, that moment was without sound. Only the rapid beat of her heart and the soft tap of the chalk against the board, like a prelude to a symphony that had been waiting 7 years to echo. The equation before her was a multivariable optimization problem with nonlinear constraints, a type of math that only graduate students specializing in applied mathematics could access. But to Amira, there was no such thing as only 4. She didn't see math as a subject confined by curriculum or degrees. To her, math was an ancient language of the world, a music she had learned from public libraries and the sporadic YouTube lectures when she lived in temporary housing in Newark. Each time she added a line, she paused for a beat, not like a student solving a problem, but like an artist considering the next note for her symphony. She didn't erase what was on the board, she respected it, like a musician harmonizing with those who came before. Her chalk strokes were not hurried, but careful, deep, full of understanding. As though her hand still remembered every model structure, every constraint condition, every rule of inference that she had once had to abandon because her mother no longer had the strength to go to the hospital alone. Then, at the corner of the board, she saw it. The friction coefficient variable, denoted mu, placed within an embedded differential equation. She froze. This was the weak point of the problem, the part that clearly the writer had not finished addressing. She bent down, wrote slowly, then stopped. Pulling from her memory, she tried a multi-layered analysis method she had seen Professor Strang briefly describe in an old video. But then she stopped. "No, that's not right," she whispered. She stepped back, taking in the whole picture, changed her approach, tried with a model of linear inner approximation. And, this time, it made sense. Everything clicked together. She smiled, not out of pride, but because she could feel that she was still here. The mind that had been buried under mops and utility bills was still alive. She wasn't dead, that part of her hadn't died. But then, the door behind her opened. Professor Elijah Wren entered with his eyes narrowed in the shadow. He had just returned because he had forgotten an important manuscript. a document he had been preparing for his upcoming presentation at the Cambridge conference. Over the past 8 months, he had dedicated all his effort to a new model of nonlinear system optimization, hoping to break through in the theory of real-time computation. That manuscript contained all his handwritten notes, and losing it was like erasing nearly a year's worth of research. He hadn't expected anyone to be in the building, especially not in the room he used as a temporary office. But when he saw the light spilling from the crack under the door, something made him pause. Carefully, he pushed the door open and froze. Before him stood a black woman in a janitor's uniform, her gray shirt wrinkled, a cap covering her curly hair. But what made him stand motionless wasn't her appearance. It was the words she was writing. Amira didn't hear him enter. She was still intently adjusting the expression of the mu coefficient, her chalk strokes neat and precise to the last detail. Elijah Wren, a man known for his strictness, coldness, and absolute intolerance for mistakes, almost held his breath as he looked at the equation. She wasn't just correct. She had approached it from a perspective he had never tried before, transforming the viewpoint from Euclidean space to normalized algebraic space for time conditions. And the worst part? It seemed right. Very right. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low and even, not angry, but as cold as steel. Amira jumped and turned around. The chalk slipped from her hand, breaking into 2 pieces on the tile floor. I'm sorry," she retreated instinctively. "I didn't mean to mess anything up. I didn't touch anything, I promise." "You just touched my blackboard and continued what an entire research team hasn't dared to touch," Wren said, stepping closer. "You're telling me it was just curiosity?" Amira didn't answer immediately. Her eyes widened. Then she exhaled slowly, as if gathering all the courage she had left. "Yes, it was curiosity and longing. I used to love math a lot. I once thought it was the only language I was truly good at. But then I dropped out. My mother had cancer, stage 4. I was the only one who could take care of her." Her voice faltered. "And after she passed, everything else slipped away with her." Wren didn't say anything. He stepped forward, bent down, and picked up the broken chalk. He looked back at the board, read the line she had written. Then he wrote on. No scolding, no warnings. He simply wrote a line under her formula, correcting a small variable. "You're wrong about the mu coefficient, but not because you calculated it wrong. It's because you didn't know I changed the constraint yesterday," he said. She looked at him, stunned. "You mean I was close?" He nodded slightly, his eyes still on the board. "Close enough that it's frightening." She stood still. "I just wanted to know if I was still smart enough to understand," Amira whispered. Wren turned back, looking at her for so long that it made her feel exposed in the classroom. "Tomorrow, 7 p.m., my office. Don't wear the uniform, bring your mind, and leave the fear at home." He walked out of the room as if he had never been there. And that night, for the first time in 7 years, Amira stood in the cold stone hallway of Harvard, no longer feeling invisible. Professor Elijah Wren stood silently behind the door of classroom 3.24, his shadow stretching across the cold marble floor. In his hand was a worn leather briefcase containing the manuscripts he had forgotten, but now they no longer seemed to be the reason he stayed. Before him was a sight he had never imagined. A black woman in a worn janitor's uniform, with rolled-up sleeves and sweat dripping from her temples, writing the final part of a problem he himself had stalled on over a week ago due to impasse. He didn't shout, he didn't slam the desk, He didn't pull out his phone to call security. Instead, he observed. Every stroke of her chalk, every pause in her hand, every tilt of her head as she considered a variable. He saw not recklessness, but a pure form of logic, one he had grown accustomed to when mentoring graduate students, yet rarely felt from them. The chalk on the board wasn't just smart, it had soul. When Amira realized his presence, she panicked like a child caught in the act. But Wren's gaze was not that of a powerful man encountering an intruder. It was a contemplative look, and slightly shaken. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice deep and steady. A simple question, but to Amira it felt like a knife cutting through her. She wanted to say she was the one who had been awarded a full scholarship by MIT, but now she was just a janitor, with an ID badge and hands calloused from chemicals. "Amira Thompson," she replied softly, avoiding his gaze. "I'm a janitor. I didn't mean to intrude. I just planning to finish the boundary condition model that I haven't solved for the past 2 months," he interrupted, his lips pressed tightly together. Silence enveloped the room. The fluorescent light above hummed softly, like a sigh. The next day, at 6:59 p.m., Amira stood in front of room 407, the office of Professor Elijah Wren in Pierce Hall. Her heart raced, her fingers cold as they touched the brass doorknob. She wore a light blue shirt and black pants, the same ones she had worn for interviews that never called back. She knocked on the door. "Come in," his voice echoed, steady and precise, like a perfect equation. The office wasn't like she had imagined. It wasn't a dry space filled with diplomas and medals. It was a living place. A faint scent of lavender in the air, a large blackboard covered in equations, a warm teacup, and a book left open by the window. Just like the man himself. Unassuming, but sharp in every detail. "You're a minute early," Wren said, not looking up from his papers. "Sorry," Amira whispered, sitting in the old wooden chair across from him. Wren turned a page and then looked up. His gaze wasn't as cold as the night before, but it wasn't friendly either. He looked at her as if trying to determine an unknown constant in a random equation. "Do you think this meeting is because I want to warn you?" he asked. She nodded slightly. "If I've crossed a line, I accept it." "You have crossed a line," he replied, closing the folder. "But not in the way you think." Then he opened a drawer, took out a thin file and placed it in front of her. "This is you, isn't it?" he asked, flipping to a page with bold letters. "Amira Thompson, East Jersey High School, GPA 4.0, SAT 1,570. Accepted to MIT full ride." Amira froze. "How?" "I have a few people in the archives. You were the top math student in the state. A poor public school, full scholarship. But then you disappeared from the system. No one knew why. Now, I do." She swallowed hard. "My mother..." "Stage 4 breast cancer," she said slowly. "Insurance wasn't enough. She needed someone to be there. I'm an only child. My father was never in my life. I dropped out to work nights. At first, I thought it would just be for a year. But then she passed. I ran out of money, time, and hope." Professor Wren didn't interrupt. He just nodded slightly. Then, in a voice as even as if reading research findings, "Instead of abandoning your intellect, you went to clean classrooms and learned from what others discarded. You didn't learn for grades or for reputation, but because you couldn't stop learning." Amira lowered her head. "I don't really have anything to prove," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm just a janitor." "No," Ren said for the first time, decisively, like tapping chalk on the board. You're someone who learns without needing a reward, and that's rarer than any degree I've ever signed. He handed her a sheet of paper, with only one line of capitalized text in the middle. If she still wants to come, let her in. Elijah Wren, Professor of Applied Mathematics, Harvard. This is my personal recommendation to Harvard Extension School, he said. If you pass the placement test next month, I will guarantee the tuition. The anonymous donor has agreed to cover the entire cost. Amira's eyes widened. Why are you doing this? Wren looked at her for a long time. Then he slowly spoke. Because I've spent 20 years teaching students from wealthy families. People who memorize well, but don't know how to ask questions. You're different. You see patterns. You break limits. You challenge compromise. He stood up, looking out the window. If I don't fight for intellects like yours, then what am I doing in this office? The question didn't need an answer. In that moment, Amira felt her heart being stitched back together, not with words, but with a real opportunity. For the first time in 7 years, someone didn't just see her, but believed in her. And she knew. If she was allowed to enter the classroom through the front door, she wouldn't walk alone. She would bring along those who had once stood outside, who had been looked down upon, who had been forgotten, just like she once had. Amira's voice weakly echoed in the room filled with fluorescent lights and chalk dust. Standing before a blackboard covered in complex expressions, she seemed like a criminal caught in the act. Not for destruction, but for daring to touch something that wasn't hers. In her eyes there was nothing but panic, but beneath that fear, something stronger. The shame of revealing a part of herself the world had forced her to bury. I didn't mean to disrupt anything. She took a step back, raising her hand in surrender. Professor Elijah Wren didn't step forward. He stood there, behind the lecture desk, the light casting across his stone-cold face. He was a man of logic, a person who had never forgiven mistakes, especially in mathematics. With over 2 decades of teaching at Harvard, he was infamous for having once failed a graduate student's thesis for missing a single page of a graph. No one in the math department dared to argue with him for more than 3 sentences. Yet now, he did not yell. He didn't call security, and most importantly, he didn't take his eyes off the chalk lines she had just written. You almost solved the hardest part of my model, he said, his voice deep and restrained. Who taught you? The question made the air freeze. Amira swallowed hard, her lips trembling as she answered, No one. I taught myself. From the library, from old PDFs, and free lecture videos. I used to be very good at math, but then my mother got stage 4 cancer. I dropped out of 12th grade to work night shifts. She lowered her gaze to the floor, avoiding his stare. I just wanted to see if I could still understand. Silence. Wren stepped closer to the blackboard. His hand reached up, lightly touching the symbol she had just drawn. He nodded subtly, almost unconsciously. You don't just understand, he said slowly. You're reinterpreting a part of the model that took me 8 months to build, and you're doing it in a direction that, until this moment, I never even considered. Amira looked up, her eyes wide with a mix of amazement and fear. I just tried to remember what I had learned. I used to love math. It was the only way I felt like I wasn't useless. Wren didn't answer. He stood still in front of the board, his eyes reflecting something akin to skepticism, slowly melting away. In his years he had encountered many geniuses, from international competition winners to prestigious PhDs. But no one had ever been a janitor in a worn gray uniform, solving equations with white chalk in the middle of the night on a blackboard he had considered the sacred domain of academia. A long silence followed, until another sound interrupted. The sound of leather shoes echoed down the hallway. A figure appeared before the classroom's window. Mark Landon, the department assistant and one of the unofficial power players in the applied mathematics department. Tall, with slicked back hair, shiny shoes, and a smug attitude, Mark wasn't a professor, but his voice wormed its way into every meeting. Many students feared Wren, but they loathed Mark. "Professor Wren?" he called through the door, his gaze immediately stopping at Amira. It only took a second for his eyes to assess ethnicity, uniform, sweat, status. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice full of suspicion. Amira took a step back. Wren turned to him, his voice sharp as a knife. "This is the person who just helped me unlock the final part of the nested linear model." Mark scoffed. "Help? Really? A janitor?" Amira lowered her head, her fists clenching. Not because Mark was wrong, but because he was voicing exactly what society always thought, only they rarely said it out loud. "She's Amira Thompson," Wren said, his gaze unwavering. "And if she agrees, tomorrow I'll nominate her for the placement exam at Harvard Extension." Mark blinked, stunned. "Professor, are you kidding? She hasn't even graduated high school, has no degree, has never—" "She had the highest SAT score in the entire New Jersey district when she was 17. Wren cut him off. "She was awarded a full scholarship to MIT, but she dropped out to care for her mother. No one ever said she wasn't smart enough. They just forgot about her." Landon opened his mouth, about to say something, but stopped himself. He turned on his heel, striding away from the window, casting a final glance back, his gaze a mix of disdain and doubt. Wren turned back to Amira. "You've just started a battle," he said, "not because of the math, but because you don't belong here in the eyes of so many." Amira took a deep breath. "Then I'll stay, even if they don't want to see me, because I disappeared once, and I swear I won't let that happen again." Wren gave a slight nod. His eyes softened for the first time, not out of pity, but out of respect. "Then let's start tomorrow. 12:01 a.m. When Harvard sleeps, you will study. I'll send you the syllabus. No exceptions, no favors. You'll have to climb on your own, just like I did. But if you're strong enough, I won't let them pull you down." Amira nodded. Slowly, surely. And that night, as she stepped out of the room 3.24, her hands still smelling of chalk, and her eyes still reflecting the light of the blackboard, she knew. No one could give her a sense of belonging, unless she first wrote her own name on the board. When the door of the classroom 3.24 closed behind Professor Wren, his footsteps gradually faded into the silent hallway. Amira stood still in the half-lit room, her hand still dusted with chalk. His words echoed in her mind like a bell she never dared to hope to hear. "Bring your mind with you." She looked down at the broken piece of chalk at her feet, once something she held like a prized possession, now lying quietly as evidence of something that had happened. Someone had truly seen her, and hadn't turned away. The next morning, Boston was still cold, the wind still cutting through the cobbled streets. But for Amira, everything seemed different. She worked the night shift as usual, cleaning windows, gathering trash, vacuuming the hallway, but her mind was elsewhere. Every time she passed a classroom, she would glance at the blackboard. Not out of curiosity, but because it had become an unspoken promise, a place she would return to as someone different. After her shift, she returned to the shabby apartment in Dorchester, where she shared a room with two elderly women, each with a small bed, a corner of the room, and a shared kettle. She took off her shoes, opened her bag, and pulled out the light blue shirt and black pants she reserved for interviews that had never called back. It was all she had to wear when meeting a Harvard professor. At 6:59 p.m., she stood in front of room 407 Pierce Hall, one hand tightly gripping the strap of her cloth bag, the other resting lightly on the brass doorknob. She could hear her heartbeat louder than the wind outside. Then she knocked for the second time, just to make sure she wasn't dreaming. "Come in," his voice answered. Amira pushed the door open. Professor Wren's office hadn't changed much from the last time, but this time she saw it more clearly. Stacks of books piled high, a blackboard full of formulas, a half-cold cup of tea beside a pile of files, and a small sign, "Mathematics is only scary until you understand it." Wren was reading a file, his eyes peering over silver-rimmed glasses. He didn't look up, simply said, his voice even, "You're a minute early." Amira smiled faintly. "I didn't want to be late. Not for the lesson, but for the opportunity." Wren closed the file, leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together. He stared at her for a long time, his gaze both probing and calculating, as if determining the structure of a complex hidden variable. "You think I called you here to do what?" he asked. "Honestly?" she replied, still gripping her bag strap. "I don't know, maybe to warn me, maybe to test me, maybe as a punishment disguised as something gentle." Wren didn't smile, but his gaze softened slightly. He nodded lightly and said, "You think I'm someone who wastes time on things I don't believe are worth it?" "No," Amira shook her head. "I think you're someone who doesn't waste a single piece of chalk." He raised an eyebrow. That was the first time he hadn't expected such an answer. Wren opened a drawer, took out a thin file. It was labeled simply, A. Thompson. He flipped it open and slid the first page toward her. Amira looked down. It was the acceptance letter from MIT at age 17, with a SAT score of 1570 and ranking in the top 1% of the state. A clearly printed page with the signature of an admissions officer whose name she had long forgotten. "This," Wren said slowly, "is proof that you were seen, and then forgotten." Amira stared at the paper, her eyes shimmering. She didn't know who had kept this copy, maybe MIT, maybe someone in the archives, but the fact that it was on this desk, in the hands of this cold professor, made everything seem more real. Wren continued, "You once belonged here, not with a mop, but with a blackboard, and if you still want it, I'll bring you back. But this time, no one is allowed to take that opportunity away from you." She looked up at him, no longer cautious, just grateful. "I will do everything to deserve it," she said. "You don't need to deserve it," Wren replied. "You just need to be honest, with me, with math, and with yourself." The moment Amira left the office, a familiar voice echoed down the hallway, accompanied by the sound of leather shoes sharply hitting the floor. Mark Landon. "Unbelievable," he said, folding his arms, blocking the way. "What is she doing in your office, Elijah?" Wren didn't answer. Mark sneered, crouched down to look at Amira. "Do you think you're special? Do you think just because you solved part of the problem, Harvard will change the rules? Wake up, this is a university, not a TV show." Amira stood still, but she didn't lower her head. Not this time. Wren stepped forward, stopping right next to her. His gaze was sharp, like the edge of chalk. "She doesn't need anyone to change the rules," Wren said. "She just needs the right rules, and that's something Harvard has long forgotten." Mark snorted, turning away to leave. But before disappearing around the corner, he threw one last comment. "The world doesn't need more janitors who delude themselves into thinking they're geniuses." Amira exhaled lightly, as if releasing the rest of her past. Wren looked at her. "Don't mind them. Those people live by the ladder of fame. You, however, are building your own bridge." That night, Amira returned to Jefferson Hall, not to clean the floors, but to start studying. At 12:01 a.m., she walked into classroom 2.14, a vacant room, the projector still on, the whiteboard, and an old desk. She sat down, opened her worn notebook, and began writing. Week 1, Review of Second Derivatives, Nonlinear Programming, Degenerate Integrals. No one knew she was there, no one clapped, no one handed her a flag. But to her, it was the day she stepped back into the world she should never have left. At exactly midnight that night, when the entire Harvard campus had fallen into a deep sleep, a black woman quietly pushed open the door to room 2.14. Not with a mop, but with an old backpack containing a notebook, a pen running out of ink, a chipped laptop, and a dream that had just been revived after 7 years. Amira Thompson had returned, not as a janitor in the shadows, but as someone who was starting to swim upstream, against the whispers, the skeptical looks, and even her own past. The whiteboard in front of her was still clean, waiting like the first page of a new book. On the desk, she placed a cold cup of coffee and a notebook with a fading inscription. "Never let the world forget you exist." She powered on the laptop, reloaded the saved lecture videos, starting with advanced linear algebra. The familiar terms echoed in her headphones. Determinant, eigenvector, convexity, Hessian. They had once been a part of her, but had been buried under utility bills, hospital visits, and late-night shifts that stretched until dawn. Now, each line of equations, each definition, each graph was returning. Not quickly, not easily, but clearly, like a long-lost relative finally coming back. For the past 7 years, Amira had lived in silence. No one asked about her abilities, no one cared about the SAT scores from years ago. No one remembered that she had been the top math student in New Jersey. Those records, if they still existed, were likely buried in a system no one bothered to look at. Her talent had been pushed into the shadows, not because it didn't exist, but because it didn't fit into the gray uniform. But Professor Elijah Wren was different. 3 days after their meeting in his office, Amira received an email from Harvard Extension School, an invitation to take the placement exam in 31 days. Attached were the materials, syllabus, and information about a full scholarship sponsored by an anonymous donor. She knew who was behind this. No need to ask. At the same time, news of her unexpected appearance in Wren's office began to spread quietly through the school. Not officially, not publicly, but enough for some in power to start taking notice and to begin to doubt. One of them was Mark Landon, the assistant head of the academic department. Mark hadn't forgotten the way Wren had openly defended Amira in the hallway a few days ago, and it irked him more than any unsolved equation. For him, Harvard was a symbol of selectivity, a place where not everyone could get in and not everyone deserved to stay. The idea of a black janitor walking the halls of Pierce Hall, not to clean but to study, was enough to shake the order he had long established. and Mark hated anything that could cause disruption. "We can't let this precedent repeat," he said in a small internal meeting, with Wren not in attendance. "If everyone who ever had a high SAT score decides to come back and demand special treatment, what will Harvard even be?" A young lecturer hesitantly spoke up. "But she's taking the placement exam. It's within the proper procedure." "She's a janitor, not a student," Mark emphasized each word. "And we don't pay for scholarships to fix the mistakes of the public education system." No one countered, but not because they agreed, but because they feared Mark. He wasn't the most powerful person, but he knew how to make those weaker than him pay the price. And now he had set his sights on Amira. Meanwhile, Amira continued her studies every night. From midnight to 3 a.m., she transformed room 2.14 into her own battleground. The whiteboard covered with diagrams, her computer running simulations, scrap papers scattered across the desk, and cold, thick coffee in a paper cup. Each week a new topic: nonlinear functions, higher derivatives, systems of algebraic equations, advanced probability. Week 2, she began a detailed study plan, handwriting all the transformation diagrams for 3 types of objective functions in applied mathematics. Week 3, she hit a wall: Ramsey theory and time matrices, a part she had never encountered. That night, she slammed her hands on the desk, her head dropping onto the book, whispering, "I can't do this." But then a message arrived from an unknown number. Difficult problems don't require perfect people, just persistence. ER. She raised her head, took a deep breath, and continued. Wren only visited room 2.14 once, at 2:18 a.m. He didn't say anything, just stood behind the glass door, watching her head down, scribbling notes, muttering each definition like a prayer. He stood there for 3 minutes, then left. He didn't need to stay, because he knew the fire had already ignited, and nothing could extinguish it. But Mark didn't think so. In the 4th week, he sent a memo to the class placement office, requesting a background check and an assessment of the risk to the institution's image if someone without an official high school diploma was allowed to take the exam. The memo was rejected because Wren had personally signed the guarantee. Mark was furious. He wasn't used to being denied, and to him, Amira was no longer a person. She was a flaw that needed to be removed. The exam day was fast approaching. Every night, Amira walked into room 2.14 with renewed determination. Not to prove to Harvard that she deserved it, but to prove to herself that she had never lost the ability to dream big. The exam was only 7 days away, and now there was no turning back. 7 days before the placement exam, while Harvard's full-time students were fast asleep in their dorms, with warm heaters and alarm clocks set for 8 a.m. on the other side of Harvard, the side not listed in the admissions brochure, not marked on the new student guide map. Amira Thompson was once again walking into classroom 2.14. Every night had become a ritual. She twisted the doorknob, turned on the projector, opened her notebook, and set up her own world, a tactical room she had designed herself. A whiteboard covered in scrap paper, overlapping formulas, optimization theorems, nonlinear programming, and high-order derivative graphs all manually drawn by hand. No new textbooks, no professors guiding her, no study groups. Only her, once considered not belonging here, and a dream that had never died. Harvard at night was not noisy. There were no laughs, no professors checking up on students, no hands raised in the air. But it wasn't silent. It was where every inner sound was amplified: doubt, exhaustion, emptiness, and the wounds that had never truly healed. Some nights, Amira had to clean the third-floor hallway before studying because the previous shift had called in sick. Other nights, she would fall asleep right at her desk, her neck slumped over, tears falling without knowing whether it was from exhaustion or from the emotions building up. In her 4th week of studying, her body started to react. The headaches from lack of sleep, her hands trembling from cheap caffeine, and her wrists swollen from writing too much. She nearly collapsed on the 3rd night in a row, struggling through convex functions and integration by parts. Then her phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. Hard problems don't get solved in one night, but strong minds don't quit. ER. She held her breath. Read it 3 times. Then she placed her hand on the board, as if that message was a quiet touch on her shoulder, and she kept writing. What she didn't know was that every step she took was being watched, not by those who wanted to help, but by those looking for reasons to push her out. In the academic office, Mark Landon quietly drafted an internal memo, his 2nd in a month, this time not asking to bar her from the exam, but for a comprehensive review of the upcoming placement test. "We need to ensure transparency," he wrote. "Avoid any suspicion that scholarships are being used to buy sympathy rather than actual merit." Though his words seemed objective, everyone understood it was aimed at Amira. One morning, after studying until 4:30 a.m., Amira left the classroom with aching legs and a slight dizziness. As she passed through the mathematics department hallway, she saw 3 male students talking, one of whom was Jason Keller, the top student who had appeared in Wren's research group. Jason glanced at her and smirked. "Oh, are you cleaning early today, or came to see the exam ahead?" The group laughed. Amira didn't respond. She had grown used to that kind of mockery, but today it cut deeper. "Be careful," Jason said, his voice rising. "Harvard can handle a few social experiments, but when people mess with the standards, it's those who truly deserve it who will face the consequences." One comment, 2 meanings, she was an experiment, a concession for diversity, a media story easy to sell. Amira walked on, not turning back, but inside, those words felt like a silent knife. That night, when she returned to the classroom, she didn't turn on the lights immediately. She sat in the darkness, quietly, eyes closed, breathing. "Who am I doing this for?" she asked herself. "For me, for my mother, for Wren, or for the hundreds like me, who were never allowed to stand where they belong?" Then she opened her eyes. The answer was on the whiteboard. In the chalk lines she had written while everyone else was asleep. In every definition she had copied 10 times until it was memorized. In every time she overcame the headaches, the panic, and the loneliness like a silent needle. She was doing it for all of that. Because she was still here, and because she had never truly left. 3 days before the exam, Wren came to find her at the Lamont Library, where she was studying a model for varying matrices. "It seems like you've finished the outline," he said, his voice steady. "Almost," she replied. "I'm reviewing Fourier series theory." Wren nodded slightly. Then, suddenly, he placed a small envelope on the desk. "What's this?" Amira asked. Wren didn't answer immediately. After a deep breath, he said, "It's from your mother. I contacted the old hospital, and a nurse who took care of her kept this letter. She was planning to give it to you after you received your acceptance letter from MIT." Amira froze. Her hands trembling, she opened the envelope. Inside was a small piece of paper, the handwriting slightly slanted, weak. "Dear Amira, if you are reading this, it means you're still walking. I always believed you were the light in every room, even when it was dark enough that no one could see. Don't let the world extinguish that light. Keep learning, no matter how tired, no matter how lonely, because you're not just learning for yourself. You're learning for all those who were forced to be silent. I love you. Always. A tear silently fell onto the edge of the letter. Ren stood still, not speaking. He understood that some things didn't need words. Amira folded the letter, placing it on her notebook, beside the formulas, graphs, and dreams that had once been buried. She looked at him, her eyes no longer trembling, but bright. Very bright. "I'm ready," she said. And for the first time, Ren smiled. The gentle spring sunlight filtered through the tinted windows of the mathematics department building, casting vibrant streaks of light onto the polished wooden floor. But for Amira Thompson, that morning was neither vibrant nor peaceful. It was a battlefield. With every step she took toward the large wooden door engraved with Room 5.01, the room where the Harvard Extension placement exam would take place, she crossed over years of doubts and the skeptical gazes of others. Her hand lightly gripped the strap of her canvas bag, inside of which was a thick notebook, several short pencils, and a handwritten letter from her mother, neatly folded between the pages of formulas, like an inner compass, always pointing her forward. She wore a worn-out cream-colored shirt with frayed cuffs, black pants that she had once worn to a job interview, and a pair of slightly tight second-hand shoes. No one held the door open for her. No one called her name with the friendly smile they offered to other students, but she walked in, head held high, her gaze steady, as one who had stood in the dark long enough to no longer fear the light. Inside, the exam room resembled an old lecture hall. 3 professors sat behind a long ebony desk, papers neatly arranged in front of them. One of them was Professor Wren, his face cold, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes betraying no emotion. The other 2, Professors Monroe and Liu, exchanged a brief glance when Amira entered. "Miss Thompson?" the proctor asked. She nodded. They gestured for her to sit at the only desk in the middle of the room, like a bare stage set for the one person without support. On the desk lay a thick exam booklet, a blank sheet of paper, 3 pencils, and a bolded line. No electronics, no calculators, no external materials. You may begin. Amira took a deep breath, then opened the exam booklet. The first question was a matrix with nested conditions, a puzzle more designed to confuse than test. It was meant to make the test taker panic, to waste the first 20 minutes simply reading the question. Amira read it once, twice. Then she began to write. Not because she understood everything, but because she recognized the pattern. Not with her eyes, but with an intuition honed over many sleepless nights under projector lights, amidst the chimes of the cleaning shift's clock, and in moments when she wanted to quit but couldn't. By the second and third questions, she handled them effortlessly, her shoulders slowly relaxing. By the 5th question, she stopped checking the time. But by the 8th, she stopped. An abstract problem, not asking for a result, but asking why the structure of the problem made sense. This was no longer pure mathematics. This was the philosophy of the model. It was the way the exam creators wanted to know. Did the test taker see the concept behind the problem, or was she just a calculating machine? Amira stared at the blank sheet of paper. Suddenly, a familiar voice echoed in her mind. "You're a janitor. You're not a student. You don't belong in this room." Then Jason's voice. "She's just a social experiment." And the whispers in the internal meeting she was never invited to. "Are we lowering the standards?" Amira gripped her pencil tightly, her eyes blurred with tears. But in that moment her mother's voice returned, soft but profound. You are the light in every room, even when no one sees it. Don't let them extinguish that light. She placed the pencil down. She began to write. Not an apology, not an excuse, but the reason the problem existed, how it modeled the rhythms of imperfect systems, reflecting how society operates on principles of imperfection. Each line was a heartbeat, each proposition a step from the back door of Harvard toward the blackboard she once wiped while wearing rubber gloves. When the clock struck 11:59, Amira set her pencil down, sweat running down her back, but her posture remained straight. Her hands were smudged with pencil dust, her wrist slightly stiff, but her eyes shone as brightly as the lights of classroom 2.14 at 2 a.m. She stood, walked to the panel of examiners, and placed her paper down. A brief moment, very brief, but she heard the whisper from Professor Monroe, seated in the middle. "The janitor girl? Really, Elijah? Even if she's decent, what does it say about our standards?" A question designed to never reach her ears. But she heard it. Her hand clenched. She didn't respond, but Wren did. He didn't snap, didn't object. He simply looked directly at her, his voice low, like an underground current. "It says we finally remembered what potential looks like." No one spoke again, but the room was silent, as if no one had ever entered, because his words were the only conclusion that needed to be remembered. Amira turned and walked out. Not quickly, not trembling, not lowering her head. She walked out of that room as though she had never been called the janitor. She walked out as if she had always belonged in that room, long ago. That evening, Amira returned to her work. No one knew she had just taken the most stressful exam of her life. No one knew she had faced the people who doubted her existence. No one asked. No one needed to know. But for the first time in 7 years, she passed through the Jefferson Hall hallway and smiled. Not because of the victory, but because for the first time she had spoken, and that voice was no longer swallowed by silence. After the exam, Amira didn't wait for the results. She knew Harvard didn't announce placement results with fireworks or applause. She simply continued working, quietly, steadfastly, as she had for the past 7 years. But although her steps remained firm, the looks of others had changed. No longer were they the quick glances of before, but now they were long, questioning stares, or worse, scrutinizing. 3 days after the exam, she received a thin white envelope, no logo, just a red Harvard seal embossed on the front. Someone had slipped it through the gap in the door of the small room she shared with 2 elderly women. Her hands shook as she opened it, not from fear, but because her heart no longer had room for another cut. Inside, just one sentence. "Congratulations, Miss Thompson. You have been accepted into the Harvard Extension Program for Mathematics. Full tuition awarded." At the bottom was a familiar handwritten note. "You didn't just pass, Amira. You outscored every applicant. Welcome to the other side of the chalkboard. E.R." She sat down on the floor. For the first time in many years, the smile on her face wasn't one of endurance or hiding exhaustion. It was the smile of someone who had just found herself. The first class, Applied Structures in Nonlinear Mathematics, began on a cold spring morning. Amira walked into the lecture hall with the scarf her mother had knitted in her last year of life. A second-hand backpack, an old notebook, and a belief that had never been clearer. The class was crowded. About 50 students, mostly full-time, their hair neatly combed, faces alert, shirts pressed, tablets and iPads glowing. Amira sat in the back row as an old reflex. She didn't want to stand out. She just wanted to learn. Professor David Monroe walked in precisely at 8:02 a.m., throwing the course syllabus on the desk, his eyes scanning the class with an attitude of half indifference, half evaluation. "Welcome to my class. This is not a place to feel comfortable. If you're looking for ease, this field is not for you." A few laughs rang out. Not because it was funny, but because of the fear of being called out. Amira stayed silent, underlining each line in the syllabus as though it were a strategic map. She didn't waste a second. The second class, the groups were divided to work on the first practical exercise, analyzing a system of nonlinear equations and proposing the fastest solving method. Each group of 3. When it was Amira's turn, Jason Keller, sitting at the front, turned around. He, a third-year student, gray blazer, haircut neatly like a LinkedIn profile picture, looked her up and down, then glanced at the other 2 in their group. He spoke loudly, without hesitation. "Sorry, is there a mistake? Is this the janitor?" The class erupted in laughter. Amira stood still. She didn't blush. She didn't lower her head. She was too familiar with this type of laughter, the same laughter that had kicked her out of MIT years ago, the same laughter that had made her hide her spreadsheets in a drawer. She simply stared at Jason for a long time before turning back to her notebook and continuing to take notes. No one defended her. No professor spoke up. And she didn't need anyone to stand up for her. A week later, the groups presented their findings. When it was Amira's group's turn, Jason said a few awkward words, then stepped back. Honestly, he didn't do anything. The analysis was all done by her, and the simplification algorithm was her creation. But she stayed silent. She knew she didn't need to make a statement. The presentation slide appeared, a recursive reduction model she had labored over for a week in classroom 2.14. This model cut the processing time in half compared to the traditional method. The class fell silent. Professor Monroe frowned and walked up to the projector. Which group solved this problem using this method? Amira stepped forward, not raising her voice, not speaking boldly, just simply raising her hand. Monroe looked at her, then glanced back at the slide, then surveyed the whole class. Interesting. Well, try not to make the others feel inferior again." The class chuckled awkwardly. Jason turned away. Amira didn't laugh. She didn't need to. She just underlined another small line in her notebook. Every sneer is a stepping stone. But even though her knowledge was acknowledged, her presence was still pushed to the periphery. She ate lunch alone, studied in the corner of the library. No one asked about her. No one shared materials. She had no study group, no allies. She once thought, "I made it in, so why do I still feel so lost?" But then one day, as she was packing up after class, a soft voice called out from behind. Amira, right? It was Natalie, the quiet black girl sitting in the front row. The recursive model from the other day, I've never seen anyone handle it like that. Could you show me how? Amira looked at her, a sincere gaze, not pitying, not curious, just a student asking another student. She nodded and smiled gently. For the first time in that classroom, she wasn't the outsider. She was a part of it. Small, but real. Natalie's question wasn't like the hollow compliments or polite curiosity Amira had received before. It came slowly, sincerely, as if extended by someone who had lived in similar hallways, with eyes once overlooked, just like hers. It wasn't just an offer to learn. It was the first sign that she was no longer entirely alone. That afternoon, the two sat next to each other in a small corner of Lamont Library. No one noticed. No one stopped them. No one mocked them. It was just two black women, one once seen as a janitor and the other once silent in the classroom, leaning over a notebook full of nonlinear models and high-level differentiable functions. "Do you see it?" Amira said, her hand slowly moving across the diagram. "The problem isn't the complexity. It's in how you recognize the rhythm within the structure." Natalie nodded, paying close attention. "You teach as if you're not proving anything, but just reminding everyone of something they've forgotten." Amira smiled faintly. She didn't say anything, but in her heart she knew mathematics, with her, had never been just calculations. It was the only language that had listened to her when the rest of the world turned away. From that day on, Natalie began sitting next to her in class. Not as a protector, but as a companion. During breaks, they exchanged notebooks, discussed topics, and asked questions that other students usually avoided. It was Natalie's quiet presence that caused the looks in class to begin to change. Not because Amira suddenly became more noticeable, but because her isolation was no longer as obvious as it had been. But that didn't sit well with Jason Keller. Jason, the once unofficial golden boy of the class, felt his academic power slipping away. He was used to having the final say in group discussions, being the first person professors turned to, and leading the presentations with the spotlight shining on his well-groomed hair and expensive blazer. Amira's presence not only overshadowed his academic dominance but also disrupted the unspoken power and status structure in the class. It made him uncomfortable and angry. Jason didn't attack directly. He didn't dare confront Ren, the one who had already recognized Amira's abilities. But he chose the familiar path of those whose privilege had been challenged, passive, insidious, and wrapped in a veneer of logic. When the professor split the groups for a task, if paired with Amira, he would forget to text in the group chat. If she proposed a solution, he would quietly ignore it. When she spoke, he would roll his eyes, sigh, and smirk at the others sitting next to him. Small actions, but calculated enough to hurt without breaking any rules. One day, after Amira missed a class due to an urgent night shift at the diner, she discovered the study group had met without informing her. When she asked, Jason just laughed. "We thought you were busy cleaning as usual." The group burst into laughter. Amira looked at them, not angry, not responding, but she remembered, not because of the words, but because of the silent consent in their attitude, the terrifying complicity of those who do nothing. It was the same way injustice was born in academic environments. But she didn't respond with words. She responded with actions. On the day the group assignment grades were announced, Professor Monroe entered the classroom, opened the slide, and projected a complex optimization chart, the problem that only one group had solved correctly. "Which group solved this using this method?" he asked, not looking at the name tags. Amira stood up. This time, she didn't raise her hand. She walked to the center of the classroom. Jason sat still, eyes slightly rolling, jaw clenched. Monroe looked at her, then nodded. "I rarely see a student use time reversal models in such a simple linear problem. Everything is fine, except for one missing error analysis step, but it's worth discussing." Amira nodded slightly, not lowering her gaze. Then she walked back to her seat, her back still straight, her hands still steady, her heart still beating to the rhythm of the one thing she believed in. True value will always be heard, if you're strong enough to not give up. That evening, after class, Ren called her over. "Take a walk with me," he said, without explanation. They slowly walked through the granite courtyard behind the mathematics building. The air was cool, the trees were calm. Ren didn't look at her, only spoke. "You've caught attention now." "Because I solved the problem correctly," she asked lightly. Because you exist where people don't want to see you, and because you exist too well. He stopped, turning to her. Jason has sent a formal complaint to the academic office, saying that you've caused an imbalance in the study group, that there's bias in the way you're being evaluated. Amira suppressed a sigh. She wasn't surprised. And what will you do? She asked. Wren shrugged. Nothing. I've attached all the logs of the materials you submitted, the revision timeline, the intermediate models, even the handwritten files. No one can deny the truth, but... He looked at her for a longer moment. You must know. The hardest blows don't come from the system. They come from those who fear you reminding them. They started the race halfway. Amira didn't respond, but in her eyes what shone wasn't hurt. It was understanding. Not everyone hated her because she was wrong. Many hated her because she was right, and she didn't need them to become that. Since the brief conversation with Wren under the yellow lights after class, Amira no longer walked with the same cautious steps she once did. Still, her pace was slow, and the same old scarf hung across her shoulders, but something in her gaze had changed, not in defiance but in affirmation. A belief that needed no words, that she belonged here, not because she had been accepted, but because she had conquered her own fear of rejection. At that time, Harvard was preparing for midterms. The atmosphere in the lecture halls began to tighten, but within the applied mathematics department, a rumor was spreading faster than the study guides. There was a problem that no student had solved in 3 years. The time variant of the Ramsey theorem, an extremely difficult branch of combinatorics and optimization. It had been posted on the department's internal forum as a midterm challenge, an optional problem, not required, but if anyone solved it, they would receive a recommendation letter from 3 professors simultaneously, opening doors to any graduate program in the country. Amira didn't pay much attention at first, but one quiet night in classroom 2.14, as she accidentally read through an old PDF of Professor Monroe's notes, she spotted a faint detail in the appendix, a structure, a rhythm. And then, like every other time, she began to draw, not with intuition, but with the habit that had become second nature, seeing what others overlooked. For 3 consecutive nights, she didn't sleep. Lamont Library became her battleground as she restructured the entire Ramsey theorem using time mapping. Instead of finding the limits in an invariant, finite system, she allowed time variations to intervene at each connecting step, a temporal logic no one had attempted before. She used harmonic folds between states to untangle the network, turning chaos into order. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. At 2:46 a.m. on the 4th night, she typed the final line and hit Submit. The next day, while Amira was still cleaning the 3rd-floor hallway of Jefferson Hall as usual, an email arrived in the mathematics department's internal inbox. Submission received. Subject, Modified Time Ramsey Proof. From A. Thompson. Attached, Full proof document, handwritten notes, progress logs. By that afternoon, the 3 professors, Monroe, Liu, and Wren, held a private meeting. There's no logical error, Monroe said, flipping through the manuscript. Not only is it correct, but it's the root of an entirely new approach. And there's no sign of plagiarism, Liu added, after cross-referencing the entire public dataset for this variant over the past 8 years. Wren remained silent. He just sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the words A. Thompson at the top of the page, as though seeing a part of himself from 3 decades ago. But the academic astonishment didn't last long. Jason Keller, who had been unable to solve the problem, quietly filed a formal complaint with the Academic Discipline Council. I suspect that student Amira Thompson plagiarized or received external help in completing this problem. A model like this, if it doesn't come from innate genius, must surely involve cheating. The complaint was sent with a nearly 20-page file listing every possible reason why someone who was once a janitor could not have solved the problem on their own. Each sentence was wrapped in polished academic language, but the content was soaked in subtle discrimination about her background, her circumstances, and the envy. A week later, Amira was summoned to the department's closed meeting room. The room had 4 people: Monroe, Lou, Wren, and Mark Landon, who now sat as an independent monitoring representative with a polite smile but eyes as sharp as a knife. On the table were a printed copy of her solution, along with the complaint. Amira said nothing. She had learned that the truth didn't need to scream. Wren was the one who spoke first. "Miss Thompson, before us is a problem that no one in the class, no matter how gifted, had solved for 3 years. But you did, and some believe that's impossible." Amira held his gaze calmly. Then slowly, she took out a worn notebook from her bag. More than 70 pages of handwritten notes, smudged ink, mistakes, crossed-out lines, geometric diagrams, and failed experimental models. Behind it were the logs of her timestamps from the library's computer system. Each file save, each version edit, each timestamp matching the access logs from her account, all recorded over 17 continuous days. Lou widened his eyes as he flipped through the pages. Monroe leaned back, arms crossed, silent. Mark still tried to maintain composure, but his hand nervously fiddled with his pen, a sign of anxiety. Wren was silent for a long time. Then he looked around, his voice deep and steady, like chalk writing on a blackboard. "I've reviewed her entire process. I monitored her access. I checked every formula she corrected, every piece of logic she had to erase, every time she started over from scratch. I was a witness." He looked straight at Jason, though he wasn't present. "She didn't just solve this problem. She reminded me why I chose to be a teacher." A long pause. So long you could hear the clock ticking. Then Monroe spoke, unemotional but firm. "There's no evidence of plagiarism. The solution has the logs, the progress, the proof. The complaint is dismissed." Mark Landon frowned. No one paid him any mind. As she walked out of the room, Amira didn't sigh, didn't smile. She just stood still in the empty hallway, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the colored glass, casting brilliant patches of light across the floor, like a patchwork map of the past and the present. An email arrived in the department's inbox. "Modified Time Ramsey proof by A. Thompson, accepted into departmental archives. Marked as first solved instance since 2019. Status verified." Recommendation letters issued by Professors Monroe, Lou, and Wren. Jason didn't apologize. Mark didn't offer any comments, but no one could deny this anymore. The one once seen as a shadow had written the light, with her hands, with her intellect, and with the persistence no one could take away. That afternoon, as the spring sun was beginning to set over the stone courtyard in front of Pierce Hall, Amira slowly walked back to her dorm room. In her hand was an embossed envelope, golden with a distinctive seal, bearing the name of a program that anyone in the field of mathematics would immediately recognize. Newton Hawking Fellowship. She knew about it. All the top students at Harvard knew about it. It was the most prestigious scholarship in academia, awarded to exceptional minds with the potential to contribute to groundbreaking research. Only 2 individuals were selected each year. Full tuition, housing, research funding, personal mentorship, and the right to publish in top academic journals. It was a dream, at least for anyone who aspired to be a professor, scientist, or a globally influential thinker. And now it was in Amira's hands, the woman who once cleaned the hallways where previous candidates walked in suits and Oxford shoes. She opened the letter. Inside was a smooth ivory page, written in sharp blue ink. Ms. Amira Thompson, you are formally invited to apply for the Newton-Hawking Fellowship. Your Time Ramsey submission demonstrated exceptional originality. This invitation includes a full-ride scholarship, private stipend, and guaranteed mentorship under Dr. E. Chung. We believe you have the potential to redefine how the world sees mathematics. At the bottom of the page, in familiar brown ink, was a handwritten note. I've reviewed your proof. We need thinkers like you. Let's talk soon. E. Chung. Amira sighed, her eyes briefly closing. Everything should have been happiness. It should have been a victory, but inside she felt a sense of displacement. The next day she was invited to meet Dr. Eleanor Chung, the head of the fellowship, one of the most prominent figures at Harvard University, an applied mathematics thinker, and a well-known figure in international scientific conferences. Dr. Chung's office, the top floor of the Harvard Institute for Theoretical Research, was a space filled with rare books, a whiteboard covered in formulas, and windows that overlooked all of Cambridge. Amira entered, her shirt worn at the shoulders, her eyes still shadowed from sleepless nights. Chung stood to greet her, shaking her hand with a friendly demeanor but eyes that were sharp as lasers. "Thank you for coming," Chung said. "First, I want to congratulate you. What you did with the Ramsey theorem wasn't just mathematics, it's a new language." Amira nodded lightly. "I just found the rhythm within the chaos." Chung smiled. "Exactly. That's what we need. Minds not confined by old definitions." She walked to the desk, placing a thin contract in front of Amira. "This is the fellowship agreement. From now on, if you accept, you will be a full-time scholar at the Institute. All expenses will be covered. There will be research support, paper editing, conference preparation, a team for you." Amira glanced over the agreement. Each line of text ran before her eyes. But then her hand stopped at a section. Fellows are expected to fully immerse in the Institute. No external employment. No personal tutoring programs. No outside commitments. She looked up. "No more side jobs?" Chung nodded. "You'll be funded. No need for that anymore." "No more tutoring kids in South End?" Chung frowned slightly. "We need you fully committed. No distractions, no past. You're not the inspirational story. You're the one creating research." "And my sister?" Amira asked. "I still call her after every shift, help her study for the SAT." "Amira," Chung interrupted, her tone deeper. "I don't care where you come from. I care about where you can go. Don't let your roots bind your ability to soar." That night, Amira lay in her small room, the yellow light casting shadows on the peeling ceiling. Her mother's letter lay beside the scholarship invitation. On one side was the dream from the outside world, and on the other the reason she had never faltered. She couldn't sleep. In her mind, the simple question kept echoing. If I let go of everything that kept me going, what's left of me? The next morning, she knocked on Wren's office door. She wasn't carrying the contract, just a folded piece of paper. Wren looked at her as she entered, his gaze calm. "Have you made your decision?" Amira nodded. She placed the paper on the desk. Wren opened it. The first line was handwritten, concise and strong. I decline the Newton-Hawking Fellowship offer." He looked up. "Are you sure?" She smiled lightly. "The fellowship offers me everything, except one thing, the right to be myself. I didn't come here just to write books, produce papers, or have my name on something. I came here to prove that someone like me can bring my whole community into this door." Wren sat in silence for a moment. Then, in a voice light but firm, as sure as chalk writing on a blackboard, he said, "They want the product. I choose the process, and I've never been prouder of a decision than this." Amira smiled, for the first time with both eyes open. She left the office, not carrying the prestigious scholarship, not the monthly stipend, not the spotlight. But on her shoulders was something no fellowship could give her: unwavering resolve without compromise. 3 days after that sleepless night, Amira walked into the Harvard Institute for Theoretical Research, the soft sound of her second-hand shoes tapping gently on the marble floor. She wore nothing new, no added adornments, just herself and a folded piece of paper in her hand. As she entered the vast office of Dr. Eleanor Chung, Amira saw warm lights, neatly arranged bookshelves, and photos of famous scholars hanging on the walls. Dr. Chung stood up, her polite smile spreading across her face, a smile that had persuaded hundreds of students to join her. "Miss Thompson," she began, "we've been waiting for your answer." Amira didn't sit down. She walked to the desk, placing the paper on the polished wood surface. Chung picked it up, her eyes quickly scanning the brief message. "I respectfully decline the Newton-Hawking Fellowship offer." A moment of silence hung in the room, as if the air had been drained from it. "Such a pity," Chung said, her voice still polite, but her gaze now cold. "You're turning down an opportunity that hundreds dream of." Amira took a deep breath and responded in a calm voice, as steady as still water. "I'm not turning down the opportunity. I'm just rejecting the pen that was about to erase my roots." Chung tilted her head slightly, sizing her up as if evaluating an unexpected variable in an equation she thought she had under control. "You know, not everyone has the privilege to choose like this." Amira nodded. "I know, and that's exactly why I can't waste it on a path where, in the end, I wouldn't even be myself anymore." Without waiting for another word, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving behind the polished light of a preordained career and the soft sound of the door closing, as if bidding a final farewell. A few days later, while Amira was sitting in her usual corner at Lamont Library, an email from Professor Wren appeared in her inbox. From Elijah Wren. Subject: Opportunity. Message: Room 2.14. Thursday, 3 p.m. Professor Liu will be absent. I've nominated you to teach. Bring your chalk. No embellishments. No beating around the bush. But for Amira, every word in it felt like a hymn. She read it 4 times. The feeling in her heart wasn't excitement, but calm, as if the large stones of destiny were finally starting to form a path. That day, at exactly 2:50 p.m., Amira entered room 2.14, the room that had witnessed all the midnight study sessions, all the sweat falling onto notebooks, all the questions she had asked herself when no one was looking. No more mops, no more rubber gloves, just her, a piece of chalk in her hand, and a clean blackboard waiting. As the soft bell rang, students began trickling in. Some, like Natalie, smiled when they saw her standing at the podium. Others, like Jason, raised an eyebrow, whispered something to their friends, and sneered. "Is this a joke?" someone muttered. Amira heard it. But she didn't waver, because she knew. She had once entered this room through the back door. Now, she was standing right in the middle of it, not invited, but claiming it for herself. At exactly 3:01 p.m., Amira picked up the chalk. She turned to the blackboard, writing the first 5 words with steady handwriting. "What patterns do you miss?" She turned back to face the class, her voice low, even, without needing to shout, "I won't throw a bunch of formulas at you today, because recursion, it's not about mindlessly repeating things, it's about finding what's been forgotten and using it to rebuild from the roots." A murmur ran through the class. Jason crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair, his gaze challenging. Amira didn't pay attention. She took the chalk and drew a spiral on the board, illustrating the flow of recursion. Not dryly, but like a breath. "When I was 16, I could solve every problem on paper, but I couldn't solve my life outside of it." The class fell silent. Amira slowly paced the podium, her eyes sweeping across the faces. "I once put down my pen to pick up a mop, but I never forgot how to calculate. I never forgot how to look at chaos and find the rhythm." She paused, smiling, not an apologetic smile, but the smile of someone who had endured enough long nights to no longer fear the light. "Now, I'll ask again. When you look at the problems ahead, ask yourselves, what patterns are you missing, just because they don't look like what you're familiar with?" A long silence. No more mocking laughter. No more whispers. Only absolute attention. That day, after class ended, Natalie walked over to her, her eyes shining bright. "Amira," she said, "today wasn't just a lecture, it was a lesson." And Amira, for the first time since her mother passed, felt something stronger than pride. The beginning of a legacy. That afternoon, when the sunlight was about to fade over the stone-paved courtyard in front of Pierce Hall, Amira slowly walked back to her dorm room. In her hand was an embossed envelope, gleaming with gold, bearing the name of a program that anyone in the field of mathematics would instantly recognize: Newton-Hawking Fellowship. She knew about it. All the brightest students at Harvard knew about it. It was the most prestigious scholarship in academia, a coveted honor for exceptional minds with the potential to contribute to groundbreaking research. Only 2 individuals were selected each year: full tuition, housing, research funding, personal mentorship, and the right to publish in top academic journals. It was a dream, at least for anyone who aspired to be a professor, a scientist, or a globally influential thinker. And now it was in Amira's hands, the woman who once cleaned the hallways where previous candidates had walked in their designer suits and Oxford shoes. She opened the letter. Inside was a smooth ivory page, written in sharp blue ink. "Ms. Amira Thompson, you are formally invited to apply for the Newton-Hawking Fellowship. Your Time Ramsey submission demonstrated exceptional originality. This invitation includes a full-ride scholarship, private stipend, and guaranteed mentorship under Dr. E. Chung. We believe you have the potential to redefine how the world sees mathematics." At the bottom of the page, in familiar brown ink, was a handwritten note. "I've reviewed your proof. We need thinkers like you. Let's talk soon. E. Chung." Amira sighed, her eyes briefly closing. Everything should have been happiness. It should have been a victory. But inside, she felt a sense of displacement. The next day, she was invited to meet Dr. Eleanor Chung, the head of the fellowship, one of the most prominent figures at Harvard University, an applied mathematics thinker, and a well-known figure in international scientific conferences. Dr. Chung's office, the top floor of the Harvard Institute for Theoretical Research, was a space filled with rare books, a whiteboard covered in formulas, and windows that overlooked all of Cambridge. Amira entered, her shirt worn at the shoulders, her eyes still shadowed from sleepless nights. Chung stood to greet her, shaking her hand with a friendly demeanor but eyes that were sharp as lasers. "Thank you for coming," Chung said. "First, I want to congratulate you. What you did with the Ramsey theorem wasn't just mathematics, it's a new language." Amira nodded lightly. "I just found the rhythm within the chaos." Chung smiled. Exactly. That's what we need. Minds not confined by old definitions." She walked to the desk, placing a thin contract in front of Amira. "This is the fellowship agreement. From now on, if you accept, you will be a full-time scholar at the Institute. All expenses will be covered. There will be research support, paper editing, conference preparation, a team for you." Amira glanced over the agreement. Each line of text ran before her eyes, but then her hand stopped at a section. Fellows are expected to fully immerse in the Institute. No external employment, no personal tutoring programs, no outside commitments. She looked up. "No more side jobs?" Chung nodded. "You'll be funded. No need for that anymore." "No more tutoring kids in South End?" Chung frowned slightly. "We need you fully committed. No distractions, no past. You're not the inspirational story. You're the one creating research." "And my sister?" Amira asked. "I still call her after every shift, help her study for the SAT." "Amira," Chung interrupted, her tone deeper, "I don't care where you come from. I care about where you can go. Don't let your roots bind your ability to soar." That night, Amira lay in her small room, the yellow light casting shadows on the peeling ceiling. Her mother's letter lay beside the scholarship invitation. On one side was the dream from the outside world, and on the other, the reason she had never faltered. She couldn't sleep. In her mind, the simple question kept echoing. If I let go of everything that kept me going, what's left of me? The next morning, she knocked on Wren's office door. She wasn't carrying the contract, just a folded piece of paper. Wren looked at her as she entered, his gaze calm. "Have you made your decision?" Amira nodded. She placed the paper on the desk. Wren opened it. The first line was handwritten, concise and strong. "I decline the Newton-Hawking Fellowship offer." He looked up. "Are you sure?" She smiled lightly. "The fellowship offers me everything, except one thing, the right to be myself. I didn't come here just to write books, produce papers, or have my name on something. I came here to prove that someone like me can bring my whole community into this door." Wren sat in silence for a moment. Then, in a voice light but firm, as sure as chalk writing on a blackboard, he said, "They want the product. I choose the process, and I've never been prouder of a decision than this." Amira smiled, for the first time with both eyes open. She left the office, not carrying the prestigious scholarship, not the monthly stipend, not the spotlight. But on her shoulders was something no fellowship could give her. Unwavering resolve without compromise. Since the day her first lecture quietly spread through the halls of Harvard, Amira did not change her lifestyle. She did not leave her small rented room in Dorchester. She still walked to school early in the morning, still carried a second-hand backpack, still ate lunch alone in Lamont Library. But something had changed. When she walked through the hallways, people started to look. And this time, it was to listen. There were no news articles, no interviews or spotlight, but emails quietly arrived in her inbox every night. "I'm in my first year. I'm scared I'm not good enough. Can I come talk to you?" I'm a single mother. I studied math 10 years ago. Do I still have a chance? I just lost my scholarship. I don't know where to start over. Can you help me? Amira read each one. She didn't answer right away. But in her heart, a quiet idea began to form, not to react, but to give back. And then, as if by instinct, Midnight Mentorship was born. No signs, no posters, no official schedule. Just a small handwritten notice posted on the bulletin board behind the library. Room 2.14, Midnight Mentorship. Thursdays, no qualifications required. Just the courage to step in. On the first Thursday night, Amira arrived at class earlier than usual. The board was still clean. The desks were arranged neatly. The hallway lights dimmed like a breath. She set her bag down, turned on the projector, and prepared the board as usual, but there was a slight feeling of anxiety. Would anyone come? 11:57 p.m. The room was still empty. 12:02 a.m. A gentle knock echoed. A figure stepped in. It was Marisol, a first-year student, always sitting at the back of the class, never once speaking. Behind her was an older man in janitor uniform, his hands still smelling of bleach. Then a young woman, her hair tied hastily, her shirt splattered with sauce. She was the evening shift worker at the campus diner. They didn't look like students, but their eyes were like Amira's from 7 years ago. She smiled, didn't ask a thing, just stood up and wrote on the board, "Why are you still here?" Then she turned back. "I don't have a lecture, no syllabus, no grades, but I have a room. And if you need a place to understand, to ask, or just to not feel alone, this is where it begins." The session didn't feel like a lesson. It felt like a refuge, a place for those who had been left behind to find a way forward. Amira didn't just teach, she listened, explained again, pointed to the board with the patience of someone who had once sat quietly in the corner of a classroom, unnoticed by anyone. An hour passed, then 2. No one left. And then, when the clock hit almost 3 a.m., Marisol softly raised her hand. "Ms. Amira." Her voice was small, like the wind. "How did you know you were good enough to stand here?" The room fell silent. The question wasn't one of doubt, but of the fear everyone had held in their hearts. The fear that they weren't smart enough, lucky enough, or didn't have the right background or vocabulary to belong in a place like Harvard. Amira looked at Marisol, then at each person in the room. Then she quietly set the chalk down, walked over, and leaned gently against the desk. "I don't know," she said softly. "I never did. I had no one tell me I was good. No one greeted me at the classroom door. No one saved me a seat in the library, but I still came. Every day, I came with a pen, with doubts as big as the sky, and one question: if I keep going today, what can change?" She paused, her eyes meeting the gaze of each person. And gradually, it wasn't that I knew I was good enough. It was that I learned not to need to know anymore. I just needed to be allowed to step in, and now I'm here to make sure you get to step in too. The room was deathly quiet. A moment later, the janitor softly clapped his hands. 3 slow claps, then Marisol, then the young woman from the diner. Then the whole room joined in. It wasn't loud, it wasn't enthusiastic, but it was real and deep. When the class ended, Amira was the last to leave the room. She turned back to the board, picked up the chalk, and wrote one final line at the corner of the board, where she used to erase the words others left behind. She stayed so we could begin. Then she placed the chalk down, grabbed her bag, and turned off the lights. Outside, it wasn't yet morning, but the light had already begun from within that very room. And that was the extraordinary journey of Amira Thompson, the black woman who once carried a mop through the halls of Harvard, now standing before the blackboard, lighting the way for those forgotten. Amira's story reminds us that brilliance doesn't have a fixed shape, and the ones who were once overlooked are often the ones who quietly and persistently change the world. If it were you, would you be ready to keep going, even if no one is waiting for you at the finish line? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like the video, share it with those who need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories that shift perspectives and empower us every day. See you on the next journey.